let me first introduce myself. My name is Alex Korolets. I'm the solutions architect here at StarWind. So today's tap room topic will be storage administrator's nightmare, how to fail at building a production cluster. So yeah, I'm going to thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, who joined our tap room today. So it will be my pleasure to share some information regarding this today's topic. Okay, so we can start. And yeah, let's start with a brief description of the problem itself. So it's not a secret that almost any company today has its own production environment. So will it be just a bunch of separate laptops or desktop PCs, or a production cluster containing lots and lots of servers working as a hive? So nothing appears from nothing, so the equipment must be configured and set ready to go. And of course, to be able to go, it must be configured correctly depending on which role it serves and what's running on it. Every one of us got used to do something according to some best practices where basically that were previously released by someone else. But the problem is most often the best practices are individual for every product, and they are individual to any person who actually writes them. So something can be possibly missed. So what is really forgotten and what we will raise on today's tap room is the worst practices, something you definitely need to avoid to be 100% sure that your service or product will not fail. So actually, while I was researching some information for the tap room, I was stunned by the fact that there are so many best practices, but so few worst practices. And that's probably because we will most probably get to the forum with the problem and we'll find a fix later, forgot about this. So it will stay local to the topic, to the forum itself. Okay, so basically there are the worst practices staying local to the actual configuration or the software. However, I'm pretty sure most of them can be unified to get a single big understanding of what not to do with the environment to prevent any failure. So today I'll cover not only the general mistakes made by storage administrators and tech guys when deploying production environment. So we will also research the most used products and what can go wrong with them as well. Okay, so let's start with the most common hardware mistakes, ending with some software and also StarWind related ones, since we all here somehow familiar with StarWind software or hardware. So our first one, let's say like our stinking chart will open the heterogeneous clusters and configurations. So suppose in your environment you're having hosts with different capacities, like some hosts with 128 gigs of RAM and other hosts with 256 gigs or higher, and you have choose to use host failure cluster tolerates policy. So the host failure cluster tolerates policy does its calculation on the basis of biggest server in the cluster. So you may end up with wasting a lot of resources in your environment. So also you are making life of DRS and DPM a bit tougher. And the golden rule is to always have hosts with similar capacities or homogeneous hosts in your cluster. Moving next, unsupported hardware, the one which is not included in the hardware compatibility list. So nothing is worse than using unsupported hardware to install software on, especially VMware ESXi. While it might work, this will definitely affect stability and performance. So quite a few components just might not be suitable for running VMware ESXi and virtualized workloads, starting with storage controllers and network cards. Also, unsupported chipset hardware can be another vector of problems, causing slowdowns or purple screens of death. And yeah, like here I have a single piece of advice. If you still want to run VMware ESXi on unsupported hardware, please use it only for non-critical or non-production workloads, such as monitoring software. So before installing or upgrading a version of ESX, it is important to confirm that the hardware or like the hardware of the target system is compatible with the hypervisor. So usually the best place to find this is go to the hardware compatibility list webpage of the actual environment and the hypervisor itself. Okay, so the third one is about domain controllers. I even had another tap room a couple of years ago about DC best practices, so you can find it on our YouTube channel. So what you never need to do is deploy a single domain controller within production environment, and don't deploy them on a single instance. It is always better to have another DC offsite, even in cloud. And also don't forget about backing up the domain controller as well. If something will happen, yeah, you will just get in real trouble. Also regarding the backups, so never store the backups on the same storage your production environment works. So I had one case regarding failing RAID array. So like quite clearly remember that. So HDDs RAID 10 bought from the same production batch. Once they started to fail one by one, and we saved the data by quickly synchronizing it with StarWind on another server. But the most interesting was the client's backups were on the same host where the disks started to fail. So yeah, like that was kind of scary. Okay, so next one, almost nothing to tell about Microsoft operating system updates. They are crucial. So unless you want to lose access to your data or to lose data at all, never forget about updating operating system. Even if you sure that it will work. So things happen so rapidly. Another one, setting memory limits on virtual machine. Don't ever do this, ever. When you set limit on virtual machine, then the virtual machine itself can use the physical memory up to limit only, and all the allocated memory above limit comes from swapping. So if you want to restrict your application, like SQL, for example, from eating up all the allocated memory, limit the memory from inside the application and not at virtual machine level. Okay, so moving forward, there was a case on my memory also regarding Exchange server placed on dynamic disk. So the Exchange was installed on dynamic disk into virtual machine, and at one time, Exchange has lost the storage. So this sometimes happens. The situation became even worse because the Exchange utility that fixes errors inside database doesn't work on dynamic disks, unfortunately. So, and there's a problem. 5 hours before business time, man really prepares to be fired. So the mailbox doesn't work. Database is large. Copying database from the dynamic disk will take much time. So in result, we recommended him to find a 2 terabyte drive and connect it via iSCSI, so pass through it to Exchange virtual machine. So we copied the database, fixed the disks, and it took something like 1.5 hours to do that. So database was copied back in 3 hours. Exchange loaded up just 1 minute before work starts, so that was a close by. Like later, guy told us that we saved his 3 letters, let's say like that. Yeah, so that happens. Okay, moving forward. Not prioritizing virtual machine restarts. So generally speaking, all the VMs in the cluster are not tier 1 and don't deserve same restart policy. So they like there may be some VMs like domain controller or DNS server or your web server which you want to come back online as soon as possible in case of host failure. Also, there may be the VMs which should be restarted in correct order for application to function correctly. This is the big mistake we do by not prioritizing restart order for the virtual machines. So if you're operating a very large environment and each of your, for example, ESXi hosts is running more than 50 virtual machines, then you definitely are in trouble because HA can currently perform a start of maximum 32 VMs. And if you haven't prioritized the restart order, it may happen that you will have to wait for quite a time before your critical VMs come back online, as HA may be busy in restarting non-critical VMs first. So yeah, prioritize your virtual machines. Okay, moving forward. Virtual machines configuration becomes obsolete. So it's always a good idea to keep the VM hardware version and VMware tools up to date. So this can help vMotion as well as storage vMotion events as features are continually added to the platforms. So of course, the individual unit, the virtual machine, needs to be able to support these new features, and the virtual hardware version and VMware tools installation are critical to make this happen. Virtual machine screensavers, if they are turned on. So what's the deal with screensavers on the virtual machines? They are annoying, they serve no purpose and are performance hog. Yeah, that's right. So they are eating up your performance. It may seem like a little deal, but it's bigger than you think. So screensavers on the virtual machine eat up server's CPU as well as memory, and what is not obvious at all, the network bandwidth as well. How much? As with everything, it depends. How much virtual machines do you have per host? Suppose it's 1% machine, and you have 15 machines running per host. That's 15% of CPU and memory lost for no reason. So yeah, like what to do about it? Easy, disable them. Unlike the end user machines, they serve no purpose here. So log in and disable them, that's it. In case if you have quite a bit of virtual machines, implement a GPO so you don't have them to turn off manually. Next one, oversized virtual machines. A very common mistake in virtual environments is in the fact that some virtual machines have too many virtual CPUs assigned. But the best practices from VMware say that basically they say the exact opposite. So the virtual machines should have the fewest vCPUs necessary because it's easier for the ESXi CPU scheduler to find enough physical cores to schedule the virtual machine so VM can use CPU time. Some guidelines here. Start with 1 CPU per virtual machine and increase as needed. So do not assign more CPUs than needed to a VM, as this can unnecessarily limit resource availability for other VMs running on the host and also increase the CPU ready wait time. So check whether your VM has too many vCPUs and whether your ESXi has trouble allocating CPU resources. Use ESXtop and look for percent ready values. So use the VMware CPU ready metric to see a percentage of time the VM has been ready but could not get scheduled to run the physical CPU. Usually a VM which has more computer sources assigned than it requires. For example, a VM that uses no more than 15 to 20% of its CPU and has configured 4 vCPUs in total. What's happening is the VM is oversized, so you can reduce the number of vCPUs to 2 and increase the vCPU utilization to 40%. Or even better, you could reduce the number of vCPUs to only 1 and have the VM use 80% of the vCPU, so it will be completely enough for it. Okay, next one, the lack of separation using vMotion feature. So vSphere can permit roles to be stacked on a network interface and spread across multiple IP addresses on a network. So to ensure the vMotion events bring the best performance, security and reduction of impact to other roles, implementing as much separation as possible will increase the quality of the vSphere environment. So keep in mind also that the vMotion event that transfers the memory of virtual machine is sent unencrypted by default. So separation, at least by the VLAN, is a good idea. The best separation would be to have all the motion traffic occurring on an isolated network on dedicated media that doesn't share physical connections with other VM kernel interfaces, management traffic, or guest virtual machine networking. Or as an alternative, just use encrypted vSphere vMotion that starts from vSphere 6.5 and later. Okay, now some StarWind cold stories and bad things happened. So the first one is quite major. It happens with if the heartbeat connections are assigned within the same physical adapter. So if something happens with the network adapter, the split brain appears. So it's crucial to have the heartbeat working through the management networking as well, using separate physical adapter. But the management networks also needs a tune. So usually the cluster and client's communication within Hyper-V environment is being performed only via the management network. So most of storage administrators assign the cluster and client communication on the management network. So, for example, administrators connect the management network from both nodes into a single switch. Then something happens with the switch, so the management network is down. What can be wrong? As we have the heartbeat on Ascasian synchronization networks, we're using StarWind, for example. So when this happens, assuming that cluster communication runs through single management network, both cluster nodes start not to resolve each other, and the split brain on the failover cluster level appears. So we still have our storage fully replicated. There is no split brain on the storage level, but instead we have the split brain on the failover cluster manager. That happens. There was one more duty, one more case on my duty when the cluster communication was running through LECP network. At some point, something happened with LECP and the management networking with cluster communication failed. So to prevent this, it is recommended to get rid of LACP and use just several dedicated management ports from each of the nodes, better with different subnets. If speaking about single management cable with two node setup, we do recommend using cluster and client communication on StarWind synchronization network as well. So at least you have cluster communication via the management network and additionally through the synchronization network. Okay, second one. So that's the single switch within stretched or on-site configurations. Imagine you have a couple nodes that need to be connected between each other, and you want them to be connected via the switch. Don't use a single switch, please. Single switch is always single point of failure, no matter what the scenario is. Use at least a pair of stacked or trunked switches to connect the nodes. Third one is pretty much the same. So that's the single network between stretched nodes in the cluster. So if your production is being replicated between different locations, even between different rooms, there may be a chance that you have a single network cable between the data centers. For providing a chain redundancy for data, it will be enough. So we can build an active-active cluster and replicate data in real time. But no matter what will cause this single cable to break, your cluster instantly loses in time. So this will most probably lead to a split brain scenario. However, at StarWind, we do have an option for such configurations because sometimes it's physically impossible to set another cable between the locations, or the cost of this is the same as, for example, like sending that SpaceX with Crew Dragon into orbit. So we do have a node majority policy that allows us to build a non-storage third node somewhere else that will work like a witness for your main stretch cluster and prevent split brain scenario. So node majority is good for one switch per location as well. Next one, iSCSI over link aggregation, always telling this one for my customers. So yeah, like I always recommend going with multipassing instead of LACP or any other kind of link aggregation if we're talking about iSCSI networks especially. So the storage networks require minimum latency, but different link aggregation implementations can act under different logic sets, leading to inconsistent results in stability and performance. So LACP basically transfers frames through the separate physical connections, and it ensures the correct frame order by comparing the hash of each transfer. So keep alive frames are transferred time to time in order to ensure the physical network availability. And such implementation does the job in terms of redundancy, but in most cases, it loses the performance in comparison with multipassing due to increased latency. Okay, so here we go again, domain controllers. Speaking about the impact of DC on StarWind HA configuration, it is crucial not to place the domain controller on top of highly available data store, at least while having a single DC, which is also fail. I mentioned that previously. So imagine you have a single DC running on HA storage, and you think, yeah, now this is truly highly available now, and then total blackout occurs. And when everything comes online again, I mean servers, you need to access the failover cluster. And the failover cluster needs a DNS. And the DNS is on the single domain controller that is inside of not working failover cluster. So that's a true nightmare you need to avoid. So quite recently, I also studied the case about ransomware protection. So as you may know, ransomware is a type of malware from cryptovirology that threatens to publish the victim's data on perpetually block access to it unless a ransom is paid. So we had one of our customers deployed our virtual tape library appliance. Yes, it protects from ransomware, and it states like as it states on our website. However, following some best practices. One of them, never join a backup host in a domain, so you need to isolate it no matter what happens. In this particular case, what happened? Ransomware encrypted all the production environment, and since the VTL backup host was in a domain as well, it got there as well. However, during the remote sessions, we identified that most of the image files provisioned by StarWind were not encrypted, and thus proceeded with creating new targets using those healthy files. So we were able to bring up all required drives and saw the VTL tapes as well that worked, just because they were not encrypted. So yeah, that's one of the stories regarding our support cases. Okay, so there's another ton of mistakes that can be potentially leading to production environment failure. However, if I reveal them all, I guess we will never leave this step room. So let's summarize what we got today. So no matter what you need to configure or tune, always follow the best practices. That's the key. Additionally, if you're not on the same page with the technology you're implementing, for example, it is worth to search worst practices as well. If it's opposite, isn't listed in the best practices, that doesn't mean if you do that, everything will be fine. So yeah, like study is our life, and yes, best practices is our guide. So that's all, gentlemen, all that I had for the today's tap room. Now don't you mind revealing your questions to me on the subject as well as off topic about StarWind, for example. So feel free to ask the questions in the questions tab. Okay, so the first question I see, Brian asks, what do I need for implementing node majority? So if you have a stretched cluster with limited networks, you will need to deploy an additional StarWind node somewhere offsite, even in the cloud. So it won't store the data. Instead, it will just arbitrate the storage nodes you replicate data between. So that's just an additional vSAN license needed according to our licensing politics. So Rosario asks, no, it's not related to this, but when is Command Center being released? Well, overdue. So basically, we have already released that one. So I'd recommend you to ask the support about implementing the Command Center, but please keep in mind that current Command Center configuration is available only to our HCA customers and only in the Hyper-V environment. So we're not deploying the Command Center on top of the vCenter configurations. So only HCA customers and only Hyper-V environments. Okay, so Jarmat asks how to increase network bandwidth if LACP is not recommended. Quite simple. So we do use the MPIO politics instead. So that allows us to use separate networks, similar to LACP, but it looks more like you send one car per tunnel instead of sending two cars in a single big tunnel. So these cars can potentially crash into each other. Okay, Any other questions, gentlemen? Do not hesitate to ask them if you have any. So Rosario also asks, should jumbo frames be enabled on iSCSI and replication network cards? It depends, basically. So if you have just a 1 gigabit networks, it doesn't work. Well, basically, it isn't so effective for small networks. But instead, if you have, for example, the SSD storage and you have 10 gigabit network cards, yeah, jumbo frames will significantly help you to improve the performance of the network channel, basically. So the answer is yes. However, there are some cases, for example, with the hardware that is not so compatible with the jumbo frames. For example, not quite sure, but there were the QLogic network cards that don't work well with the jumbo frames. Will StarWind support RDMA or older versions soon? Yeah, I guess. So we have RDMA support already implemented. So it is used on the synchronization network. And yeah, we're planning to update this technology and also support all the previous configurations with RDMA support. Yep. So Eric asks about the DR side over WAN. How to deal with IP change for smooth user access. So basically, if you're creating a replication, you need just to set up the static IP addresses. It is more recommended to go that one. So if I understood your question correctly. Okay, no more questions left, I guess. So at least for now. Well, gentlemen, if you still have any questions, do not hesitate. Yes, one more question I can see, ReFS or on TFS. Depends on the actual configuration. Both file systems are quite good, depending on the Windows Server version, basically. So you can use both of them. There are pretty much no restrictions on that one. Yeah, one more question. Philip asks, is it practical to use dual 10 gig network cards? Yes, of course. So if you have small deployment, for example, just 2 node setup, and you have a single dual port 10 gig network card for StarWind iSCSI connections and synchronization of the data, you can simply use that one. The only thing you need to consider is to place the heartbeat on another physical port, not only on this dual port network card. So it can be built in the motherboard network port, 1 gigabit, that most commonly is used for the management. So you can at least assign the third heartbeat channel on that one. Okay, so gentlemen, thank you for all your questions. If you have any questions further, do not hesitate to ask them through our social media. Also, this step room recording will be soon available on our official YouTube channel. So thank you for joining today's topic. Okay, so I guess there are 2 more questions. Let me simply answer them before we will take off. So The primary DR site are using static IP addresses, but when the primary site fails over to the DR site, users lose connection. I'm trying to find a better way for users to resume access quickly. So that's the question about the production environment, basically. So what you can do is, well, basically, there is a problem that the IP addresses will be changed. However, as far as I remember, you can just set static IP addresses on the user virtual machines as well. So just because you're replicating the virtual machine, it has a single entity. So the virtual machine in the production environment is has a single IP address. And other question is it good practice run straight through cable between two node servers for sync and heartbeat? Yeah, so we do use the direct attached cables, and yeah, basically that is good. And the last question, right? So I was thinking of using 1 gigabit for management and 10 gigabit for SCSI and 10 gigabit for replication. Is this the best way for two-node solution with two 10 gigabit switches? Yeah. So that's correct. You have one of the network cards used just for the SCSI connection. So port number 1 will be connected to switch number 1. Port number 2 connected to switch number 2. And that's the same with another network card that will be directly used for the StarWind synchronization. So you connect port number 1 to switch number 1, port number 2 to switch number 2. So yeah. Okay, gentlemen, so again, you can just send all your questions to our social media if you have any, or even contact our sales team, so they will be able to help you with all the questions. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to thank you for joining today's topic. So I wish you all the best. Stay safe and fly safe, basically. So cheers, goodbye, thanks for your attention. Thanks for all your questions.